The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Summer is here. Maybe that allows time to slow down, savor a good book, be more mindful readers. That's what we're doing all this week with Governor General's Literary Award-winning poet and writer, George Elliott Clarke. Giller Prize-winning authors Dr. Vincent Lam and Elizabeth Hay, and writer and novelist Thea Lim. Tonight, is there a right way to read? That's next on The Agenda in the Summer.
I think when we ask the question, how should one read, it sounds like a very big question because obviously, for me, I like to read in with noise. I know that doesn't really make sense. I like having things around me, but I actually get overloaded with a lot of noise if I'm cooking and the fan is on. I get very frustrated. So we all have our own way of reading, and I wanted to speak to you all about that. George, I wanted to start with you. What's the difference between reading and listening to a piece of writing, poem, or story?
That's a great question. What is the difference? Well, with reading, of course, you are basically presenting yourself to the intelligence of the writer who you are reading and trying to fathom and refabricate in your own mind the ideas and the scenes and the characters and so forth that are being put forth, invented for one's pleasure by and entertainment and edification by the writer. And in terms of reading aloud, which I think is extremely important, you have to read some portion of whatever it is you're reading silently. You should read it aloud.
Even on the train, going to work?
Well, try not to be too obtrusive in terms of other people's privacy and so on.
What does reading out loud do?
It puts you in touch with the emotions behind that piece. That is so important because we often think of literature, or we're taught to think of literature as simply being a series of stories or whatever, or poetry that rhymes and makes pretty pictures and so on. But every piece of writing, not only is it invested with communicating ideas and philosophy, it is also conveying the emotion of the author in putting forward these plots, putting forward these characters, creating these scenes. Emotion has to drive everything. I think the beauty of poetry is that emotion and intellect are absolutely conjoined. But you can only really feel that if you, in fact, read those words aloud.
Does anybody else do that? Read out loud?
I read my own work out loud. I don't read other people's work out loud. And I read my own work out loud because then I know whether the rhythm is right, immediately if it's awkward, I'll stumble over it and know that it needs to be edited. But it's interesting. So I don't read other people, not to myself, I don't. That would be an interesting exercise, except it would slow me down. For me, reading is the entering the page. Entering the page. Yeah. Not getting lost, actually, waking up, being aroused and invigorated by what I'm reading. I don't want to lose myself, I want to meet myself.
Anyone else read out loud, or?
What I've been doing lately is maybe a little bit sacrilegious, but I use actually a program that reads books to me, which is a trick I actually learned from a friend of the show, J.L. Richardson, so that I can do the dishes and the laundry, my glamorous life. But it's really interesting because I think you might be a bit horrified, George, but because the robot isn't very good at reading, and you can choose different voices, but they're all kind of terrible. But I think it's really fascinating because when you listen to a lot of books that way, it creates kind of a democratic effect where it's equally bad at reading all of them to you. So what it winds up, I think, is allowing some essential nature of the work to come to the fore. But yeah, it's been sort of, these technologies are such a part of our life now, so it's been very interesting to interact with literature through them.
They're not a part of my life.
Liz is like, no. Vincent, what about you?
Similar to Liz, I read my own work aloud as I'm editing, and that's tremendously important as part of my editing process. I mean, one of my favorite spots to read is sitting on the porch in front of my house. And it's great because I love the spot, and it's also great because people might come by and say hello. I feel like I'm both in that space and able to enter another space through reading. But I do feel that if I were to sit there and read out loud,
They'll be like, something's happening with Vincent.
my neighbors might be concerned. George could probably pull it off.
If I could just say something very quickly, and it goes like this. And I'm coming back to this notion of reading aloud not only as an act of homage to another writer, and especially a poet, but also as a way to hear the textures of the words, the syllables, the accent, the rhythm, as Liz has mentioned, as a way of understanding the entire worldview, the heart of the matter, the pulse of the matter. Because when you read, I gotta quote Ian Fleming, somebody has to. He said that all speech starts with the stomach muscles. So your very act of speaking comes from the gut automatically, and then you add to that pulse, breath, exhalation, inhalation, the movement of your tongue, your teeth, through your mouth to actually express those words. So that when you get to say something like, or you get to quote someone like William Blake and his Sunflower, and he says, sunflower, weary of time, and you feel it. You feel the shivers go down your spine.
Yeah.
Right? Because, or Yeats, that is no country for old men. Right, and you suddenly think of the Hollywood movie. Oh yeah, that's right. It's not a good country for old men.
Well, it's so interesting you mentioned movies, because I've had some favorite books, and then I've watched the TV versions or the movie versions, and sometimes it's been a good experience, but sometimes I'm like, that's not how I saw it. That's not how I felt it. Is that something that is that the point that has anyone else experienced that?
Well, just to jump in on that very quickly, the thing that you're really, and I wanted to say this earlier, I like to remind students that there's a reason why actors and directors actually come at scripts, whether it's for a play or for a film, by having that reading aloud of the script. Because that is what puts you in touch with the character, with the whole story, and the development of the character is actually hearing those words being presented.
But you're a performer. You are a performer.
Everybody's a performer.
Not like you, George.
Each of us may have a bit of ham inside us, but no, you are a performer. And someone who isn't a performer has a different relationship with the page, and it's an intimate, silent relationship.
Liz, silent reading is definitely okay. I recommend it for everybody.
But I agree with you about reciting poetry and how wonderful it is when you actually memorize a poem and can recite it, however badly.
One other just little writer attached to what you just said. One of the reasons why Barack Obama was a breath of fresh air in 2008 when he was seeking the election for the first time is because of his oratory.
Yes, of course.
Those speeches, they were so great compared to George W. Bush and his inability to utter anything that was comprehensible. That fact that he was able to articulate positions so beautifully, powerfully, emotively, and move people in the millions to desire something better.
But that's also, as we've seen in history, though, there's been great orators who've moved history in the other direction.
Absolutely, but that's not the fault of oratory itself or the fault of rhetoric. And we should remember that for instance, at the time of Shakespeare, if you're going to become a poet, you studied rhetoric.
Yes.
Rhetoric is about tricks of speech, ornaments of speech, metaphor, tropes of one sort or another.
But there's also silent eloquence.
Yeah,
there's silent eloquence on a quiet page.
Sure, I agree. Yeah, you can sit back and relax with the book and read it silently.
I mean, we're talking about reading now.
Yeah.
And you've taken over with reading aloud. And I'm just putting up a word in defense of reading quietly to oneself.
I'm all in favor
where you're
of-
not bothering anybody.
I'm all in favor
Or
of
if there's a
silent
sleeping
reading.
baby in the room, but I wanted to kind of.
Well, I think what I like about what both Liz and George are saying, American presidents aside, is that what you're talking about is a kind of reading that gives so much credit to the author for being deliberate about the choices they made, that every single sound, every syllable, every piece of punctuation matters. And I think that's so true. I think that sometimes when there may be a rush to publish, or when you think about the glut of books that's published daily, there's this sense that there isn't enough time, I think, to put that work into it. But I love that idea of getting readers to believe that, you know, that authors think about every single thing on the page. Because when I used to teach close reading, sometimes I would have students who would say things like, they didn't really think about where this comma went. And I say, no, they did. So I'll have to point them to both of you as you think about every single piece of the work. Every single piece of the work matters. And you can read it silently, or you can read it aloud, and you can feel kind of the torque of how much every single piece on the page matters.
Well, I wanted to ask Vincent this question because on the ravine, I think all of us probably know someone who has gone through something similar. When you're writing, do you ever worry about how what you're writing will impact a reader, if it will cause like maybe moral distress from someone who's reading your writing?
Well, it's always possible that that may happen. And moral distress can be very enhancing and distressing and productive and limiting. The experience of being challenged as a reader is, I think, one of the deep values of reading. And so that's also one of the reasons we write. So I don't think we can shy away from being challenging as writers. I think it's very important that we're respectful. And part of being respectful for me as a writer means writing from a sense of what I feel is true to the characters who inhabit these pages, and true to them as human beings, as fictional human beings, but as human beings, rather than trying to impose some sort of authorial agenda upon them. And when I reflect on the question you asked about reading and also film, and this notion that sometimes film feels like it's less, you know, cinema feels like it's less. I think that when we see something on the screen, we simultaneously are given less and more.
What do you mean by that?
So the more part is obvious because we're given sounds and images and sets. It's all kind of right there. It's like a buffet. But we're given less because all of that takes so much of our sensory attention that we often have less room to actually enter, inhabit, and imagine. And so books give us also less but more, and they give us less because it's just 26 letters, and there are some punctuation marks. And I do think actually a great deal about my commas, much to the consternation of my editor. Stop it already. Just put the comma wherever you like. Anywhere.
What about an exclamation point?
I shudder to think what my editor thinks right now while we're talking about this, but yeah, a lot of thought and a lot of care on my part, frustration on the part of my editors, perhaps. But we just have the 26 letters. We just have a few marks on paper, and so we're giving less, but there's so much more room to imagine and inhabit. And I think if we're actually writing about things which matter, then there is the potential that they will be difficult to read. And that's also part of the importance. And so if that's what we're doing, then we have to leave space for people to inhabit it as their mind will allow them to inhabit it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think this is something I think about a great deal, perhaps in part because this novel was the first novel that I wrote that a number of people read, and I was surprised then to have to sort of live in the consequences of my actions. Some people have very strong reactions to how the story is quite sad, and I don't think it's bleak, but some people read it that way, and it did make me think twice about not only what I put readers through, but also what I put my characters through. I tend to write about characters who are not white, who are dealing with social barriers, and sometimes I struggle with the fact that I'm writing stories where I'm putting them through more suffering, you know? And is that sort of, I don't want to not write about the real world, and I don't want to not write about those kinds of characters, because I think that's what I feel my role as an author is to do. But it does feel sort of like, how do we find that balance between not kind of relying on narratives that are sort of run by trauma, where the reason why there's drama, the reason why there's excitement is because we're just traumatizing characters, but how do we also write about the real world in a way that gets at some of those things we were talking about before, you know, about the politics of it, of the barriers of what makes the world what it is.
Kind of expands your mind to other people's realities.
Yeah, and I sort of love what you say, Vincent, that maybe sometimes it's about trusting the reader to step back if they need to, you know, to engage if they need to. Because in the end, I think literature, I always think it's sort of like a holodeck, like from Star Trek. It's a simulation for the problems of our world. It's a place to work through certain things in a place that's more safe, and that maybe that is what our role is as artists, to create that.
Yeah, and then the ideal reader would be someone who brings sympathy to these characters.
Yeah.
And who has a mind open enough to change.
Yeah. Well, I think that's what's exciting about literature. You can people often change their minds unintentionally when reading literature.
And the wonderful shocks of narrative. Who would want to lose those?
Yeah.
You know?
Elizabeth, you know, you've said that when you were a broadcaster, you described yourself as a writer with a split personality.
All right.
What did you mean by that? I thought that was so interesting.
Well, that was when I was in radio years ago, and there were radio scripts that I needed to write, and they followed a kind of formula, a journalistic formula of place and you know, voice, and then these were, as I say, radio documentaries. And on the side, I was doing my own writing, such as it was, you know, in the notebooks I kept, which was my way of, you know, staying sane. But the difference between those two kinds of writing did make me feel like a split personality, that I had to write a certain way for radio, and then I could write my own way in my own life. And then I realized over time, actually, that wasn't true. That the elements that make a good radio story are the elements that make any good story.
Which elements would you say those are?
Well, what is the story about? You know, the old horrible producer's question, what is the story about? You know, in radio, is perfectly acceptable to ask. But I didn't ask it of myself in my own writing. Where's the momentum? How are you building? What's the next, you know, how does one thing build on the next? These were essential questions in radio, and I didn't trouble to ask myself or make myself address them in my own writing. And also the different, you know, in radio and in any good writing, there's economy, directness. Someone is actually talking to you about what matters to them. Yeah.
One of the themes that I was going
to say, when you applied the rules of radio to your own writing, did that make the process of your own writing more or less enjoyable?
Oh, it's all hard. No, I was very willing to get away with murder in my own writing.
It's so interesting because it's like anyway, it's a different tangent. One of the themes that I guess I am getting from while we're having this discussion, when it comes to reading, some people read out of boredom. Some people might read because they want to learn more about something. But is the purpose of reading a story, a poem, could it be to find meaning, George?
Well, yeah, of course. It can be about finding meaning, but it can also be about thinking differently, learning to think differently yourself. Because every writer is putting forward their philosophy of life and whatever it is that they are writing, everything that they write. And so the reader can be challenged, can be inspired, can be angered, can be turned off, can be turned on, can be excited. All of the above is possible so long as that reader, of course, is engaging with the particular ideas and philosophies that the writer is putting forward. But I'm going to, again, claim the prerogative of a poet and recite a little thing here, which is about a visit to the Annapolis Royal Historic Gardens. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm just going to read the last portion of it. I visited the gardens on a fall day. I think it was 2000. Nearby accumulates a pungent cascade of leaves, then the thick, gigantic stalks of marsh grass, with sunlight baying in, nostalgic, regretful, imploring, like the speaker in a John Thompson ghazal, with the last maniacal mosquitoes whining, comme des plutres, and strafing still fragrant, still bloody roses, near where the train tracks are kaput, all torn up now, these roses glistening and perfuming dogmatically, while the eye hooks on notorious flagrant orange-red trees and bowers of vines, other overhanging things darkening just as the sun darkens while first launching light against the dikes, the marsh, in dying brilliance, equivalent to what Carmen paints in Low Tide at Grand Pre, dismissive of our idiot anxieties and ironies, stately lances, the august, sepulchral, elegiac light.
Excellent. Well done.
That's incredible.
Oh my golly.
That is incredible.
Oh my
And this
God.
is your poem.
Yeah.
I knew that.
Just to illustrate,
Just
the
a little
power.
something.
Well, just one other quick thing, very quick. I mean, what we've also been talking about in this session of the program is voice.
Yes.
VOICE, voice, and the different ways in which a reader picks up the voice of the author, and the disseminated voice of the author through characters and so on. But it all comes back, ultimately, for me, to the vocalization and the verbalization.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned voice, but Vincent, are words or is context more powerful?
That's like choosing between sweet and salty.
Oh, we can hang out. Popcorn with M&Ms. Anyway.
I think what we're trying to do as writers is we're trying to sometimes, I think the best moment for me as a reader is when I read something that both surprises me and then in the same instant seems utterly self-evident.
Yeah.
I think, yes, I mean, that's what that flower looks like. That's how someone would say that. And I'm stunned by how right it is. And I think we get there by placing words in context in an observant and a curious way.
Thea, I see you nodding.
I was just thinking about the phrase that, great writing is shocking but inevitable, which I always hate because I'm like, that's impossible. I'll never be able to do that. But I think that's exactly it, isn't it? And I think when it comes together, even if it's something you've done yourself, there's still something mysterious about how it happened, which I think is part of the wonder that you feel like you're tapping into something timeless or universal.
And then the reader, of course, is or the ideal reader is someone who enters the book willing to inhabit other lives and then meets themselves.
Yeah.
Meets unexpectedly something that actually really resonates with their own life, and then their own life suddenly has so much more meaning.
Yeah, and I think something that's challenging about our current climate of reading is that readers are so often encouraged to rank books, to give it a score on a scale of 1 to 5. And I think that what that often means that happens is that readers think of a work as almost like a transactional good. Like, is it kind of like a salad that, it was a 4-star salad? Did it really do what I wanted it to do? And so I think what's lost in that is that idea that you should actually need to meet a book where it is. Like, sometimes if a book is unsettling, as you were talking about, or a book is boring, maybe it wanted to be that way. And can we meet those books where we are? Can we inhabit? Can we accept what they're offering us? We don't always have to like it. I think liking is kind of overrated, but can we sort of appreciate what it's offering to us?
Is there a right way to read?
Well, I think it depends on the book, because there's plenty of books that are very happy, I think, to provide an escape, to provide something that's familiar. And I personally love reading books like that. And then I think you have to be able to distinguish between the kinds of books that maybe are there because they're trying to push the bounds a little bit more, because their job is to maybe require us to think about, kind of issues that are close to the bone, that are real, that are maybe even in some dimension spiritual. So I think as readers, we have to be able to discern what kind of book we're reading.
As writers, you're sharing parts of yourselves that we wouldn't know unless you shared it with us. Isn't there an expectation that you are putting yourself out there for people to see?
Well, I think fiction has many layers.
But it's still there, right? You need to know or
Well, yes,
experience
but
something to be able to describe it.
I think the fiction that certainly I myself, or I tell myself as a writer, is this fiction that I'm just interacting with the book. And I maintain that fiction right until the very end, until the book is published. I love that. It may not be true.
But it works for
I
you.
love it,
Yeah.
yeah.
We're not going to disturb the process because what you're doing is working so far.
I mean, I really relate to that. That's so funny because I think you sort of think of it as almost like an object, almost like when people film something disturbing as a way of getting distance. And I think that's sometimes what I'm doing when I'm creating. So I think of it as an object that exists on its own. And it's totally true that when a reader reaches out to you and says, oh, that moved me or that spoke to me, you're like, oh, you saw through me. It's this moment of surprise. But it is, I think, so wonderful. I'm always so touched when someone would bother to take the time to write me a note, to not only engage with the work, but to also write to me and tell me how it made them feel. I think those people must be great and noble people. On the other hand, there are many platforms, I think, in which readers can discuss works with each other and sort of let loose if they really didn't like something. And I think of those platforms as being solely for readers. I think authors should never go to those places. They form an important function, I think, in civic society.
So you'd never want to be like a fly on the wall in a book club?
I have attended book club meetings, which I also always kind of love. It's always so interesting to see people arguing about what your own characters meant, which I think is really fun. But no, I think readers need that space. They need the space to say, as much as I sort of want everyone to sort of approach my work in good faith, being a reader is a really important function, and you deserve the space to not like something, to hate something, to argue about it with your friends. I think those spaces where readers can do that are important and to some degree sacred, and I think authors should stay out of them.
It's so as I'm sitting here, I'm like, I can't believe this is my job. This is amazing. That concludes our conversation on this topic. We're going to be discussing something that I think a lot of people shy away from admitting or even talking about, which is failure and other obstacles. So thank you so much for your time, and it's been such a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Our guests all this week are George Elliott Clarke, author of many books, including Where Beauty Survived, an Africadian memoir. Dr. Vincent Lam, whose new novel is On the Ravine. Elizabeth Hay, author of the just published novel Snow Road Station. And Thea Lim, author most recently of An Ocean of Minutes.
The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.